The market was alive that morning, overflowing with voices and colors. Vendors called out their prices, children darted between stalls, and the smell of roasted corn, spices, and fresh fruit mixed in the air. It was the kind of place that felt endless, where time slowed down into the rhythm of bargaining, laughter, and the shuffle of footsteps on dusty ground. Amara moved carefully through the crowd, her basket hanging from her arm. She was in her early 20s, though responsibility had already carved its weight onto her shoulders. Since her father's passing, she had become the anchor of her family. Her younger siblings looked to her for guidance, and her mother leaned on her more than she would ever admit. That morning, Amara was buying beans and oil, counting coins twice before handing them over. She stretched her thin budget with practiced skill, reminding herself she couldn't afford mistakes. Every decision mattered, every purchase calculated. Yet, behind her calm face, there was a silent yearning, a dream of a life where she wasn't always the one holding everything together. She paused at a spice stall, inhaling the sharp scent of dried peppers, when the world shifted. At first, it was only a sound, an odd hiss, like metal straining. Then came the explosion. A gas cylinder from a nearby food vendor burst with a deafening roar, flames leaping into the air as if the sun itself had fallen onto the market. The shockwave knocked baskets and stalls to the ground. People screamed, scattering in every direction. Smoke rose thick and black, choking the air. The market's laughter turned into chaos. Amara dropped her basket, frozen for a heartbeat, as fire licked across wooden stalls, devouring fabric, fruit, and wood with ruthless hunger. She snapped out of her daze and turned to run, but the crowd surged too quickly. She was shoved sideways, tripping over a fallen basket of oranges. Before she could rise, the wooden beams of a nearby stall gave way with a sharp crack, crashing down across her leg. Pain seared through her body. She gasped, clawing at the ground, trying to free herself. But the weight pinned her down. Around her, people rushed past, their faces blurred with fear, each one too desperate to stop. The fire was closing in. Heat burned her skin, smoke filled her lungs, and her vision swam. Amara coughed, tears stinging her eyes. In that moment, terror gripped her chest, not just of dying, but of leaving her siblings alone in this world. She prayed for a miracle, a whisper in her heart, begging for rescue. And then he appeared. Through the haze of smoke, a figure emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a calm urgency that cut through the panic. His clothes were simple, his face streaked with ash, but his eyes, steady, sharp, and unafraid. "Hold on," he said, his voice low but firm, as though he could command the fire itself to pause. In one swift motion, he lifted the beam, pinning her down. His strength was startling, effortless, as if the weight meant nothing. Amara gasped for breath as he pulled her free, steadying her with a hand that felt both strong and gentle. "Stay with me," he urged, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as flames roared behind them. He shielded her body with his own, guiding her through the smoke, dodging falling beams, never slowing despite the chaos around them. Her heart pounded, every step a blur of heat and noise. She felt his presence more than she saw it. His steady grip, the firmness of his arm, the way his voice cut through the panic. "This way. Keep moving. Don't stop." They broke through the thickest of the smoke, stumbling into a narrow clearing where the fire hadn't yet reached. Amara collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, her chest heaving as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She looked up at him, her savior, trying to memorize the lines of his face, the shape of his mouth, the firelight dancing across his dark skin. But the smoke still blurred her vision. She caught fragments, his eyes steady and filled with something unspoken, his hands strong and scarred, the sharp cut of his jaw as he scanned their surroundings for danger. "Who?" she started, her voice hoarse. But before she could finish, he was already turning, his gaze fixed back toward the flames. Without another word, he slipped into the chaos again, swallowed by smoke and fire. "Wait!" Amara cried, struggling to rise, but her legs trembled beneath her. He was gone. Around her, others rushed to help survivors, pulling water buckets, dragging carts to clear paths. The market burned, and still she searched the crowd for him. The man who had saved her life had vanished like a shadow at dawn. As the hours passed and the fire was finally beaten down, Amara sat among the ashes, clutching her scraped arm and burned skirt. Her body shook, not just from fear, but from something deeper, an ache in her chest she could not name. She remembered the press of his arm against her shoulders, the calm power in his voice, the strength that had pulled her back from death. She did not know his name, but she knew she would never forget him. That night, as she lay awake, the memory replayed like a haunting melody, his face half hidden, his presence unforgettable. He had been her savior and her mystery, and though she didn't understand why, Amara felt as if fate had tied her to that stranger with invisible threads. Somewhere in the ashes of the market fire, something had begun, something that would follow her for the rest of her life. The fire left scars on the town that could not be measured in ash or rubble. The once bustling market was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness, charred wood jutting up like broken ribs. Families mourned their dead, and the sound of grief carried through the streets for weeks. Amara survived, but survival came with its own weight. She carried the smell of smoke in her hair for days, the raw sting of burns on her arm, and a memory she could not put down. The memory of him, that stranger whose strength had pulled her back from death, became a ghost she lived with. She had seen only glimpses, his eyes steady, his hands scarred, his voice calm amid the fire. Yet those fragments burned brighter in her heart than the flames that had consumed the market. In the weeks that followed, she asked around, searching for answers. Did anyone see him? The tall man who pulled people from the fire? But the replies were always the same. Shaken heads, blank stares. Some swore they never saw such a man. Others said maybe she imagined him, a guardian spirit in human form. But Amara knew he was real. She had felt his hands steadying her, had heard the strength in his voice. He had been flesh and bone, and he had vanished. Years passed, the fire became a story told in whispers, then a shadow pushed to the background of everyday life. The market was rebuilt, though never the same. New stalls stood where ashes once lay, bright paint covering hidden sorrow. Amara's life moved forward, though it often felt like walking against the current. She finished her studies despite long nights of exhaustion. She worked tirelessly, carrying the weight of her family on her back. When her younger siblings looked at her, they saw a pillar of strength. But in quiet moments, when no one was watching, she felt the cracks in her heart. Every success tasted incomplete. Every celebration carried a hollow note. It was as though something essential was missing, something her soul kept reaching for, but could never touch. At times, she hated herself for thinking of him. After all, she did not know his name, did not know if he had survived that day. Perhaps he had his own family, his own story, his own burdens, and yet, in her heart, he lived like an unanswered question. On lonely nights, when the house grew still and her siblings slept, she would lie awake and picture him stepping from the smoke once more, his hand reaching for hers, his voice telling her to keep moving. Why had he saved her, only to disappear? Did fate tie them together only to tear them apart? Amara found herself asking these questions even as she grew older, wiser, stronger. Time could not erase the imprint of that moment, the feel of being seen, valued, protected, if only for an instant. Her mother once asked her why she never seemed interested in the young men who admired her. Amara smiled faintly and said, "I'm busy with work. They don't need me distracted." But deep inside, she knew the truth. No smile, no touch, no voice could match the one she still carried in her heart. The stranger had become both a comfort and a wound. He was proof that miracles walked among men, proof that in her darkest moment she was not abandoned. But he was also a ghost, an unfinished story she could not close. 10 years passed this way, the seasons changing, her responsibilities growing heavier, her heart growing lonelier. Still, Amara clung to the memory of that day, not just the fire that nearly ended her life, but the stranger who had given it back. She did not know that fate was already weaving its threads again. She did not know that somewhere, in another part of the world, that same stranger carried her memory too, and soon, after 10 long years of silence, the past would step back into her life, as real and unshakable as the day he had pulled her from the flames. 10 years had carved Amara into a woman of strength. She was no longer the frightened girl pinned under a burning stall, but a leader in her community, respected, admired, and quietly envied. Her work at the community center had given hope to families still healing from loss, and her sharp mind had earned her a place among those who shaped the town's future. Still, there were nights when silence reminded her of what she lacked. A corner of her heart remained untouched, waiting for something, or someone, she could not name aloud. That evening, the town held a charity gala. The hall glowed with golden light, chandeliers shining above rows of tables draped in linen. Music floated through the air as people gathered, dressed in their best, their laughter hiding the weight of their own struggles. Amara moved gracefully among them, her gown a deep shade of blue that reflected both elegance and calm. She smiled when greeted, accepted compliments with quiet poise, but her mind was elsewhere. She had been invited because of her work in rebuilding efforts, and though she stood in the center of celebration, her heart remained distant, like a guest at its own gathering. Then it happened. Her eyes caught him. At first, she thought her mind was playing its old tricks, dragging ghosts into the present. Across the hall, near the edge of the crowd, stood a man. Tall, broad shoulders, a presence that seemed to silence the noise around him. His face was older now, more rugged, carved with years of hardship. But his eyes had not changed. They were the same eyes that had looked into hers through smoke and fire 10 years ago. Amara's breath caught. The glass in her hand trembled, the liquid inside rippling with her shock. For a heartbeat, the world blurred, sound fading into a low hum. She could only see him. The stranger. No, no longer a stranger. Her savior. Alive. Real. Here. He looked up, and their gazes locked. Recognition flashed instantly, followed by something deeper, something guarded, burdened, heavy with things unsaid. Her feet moved before her mind could catch up. Each step carried the weight of a decade's worth of questions, of sleepless nights and restless dreams. She reached him, her voice trembling as she forced words past her lips. "It's you." His jaw tightened, his eyes softening for just a second before he masked them with calm. "Amara." The sound of her name from his lips nearly broke her. Her heart pounded as anger, relief, gratitude, and disbelief collided inside her. She wanted to embrace him, to strike him, to weep into his chest, to demand why he had vanished without a word. 10 years, she whispered, her voice cracking. 10 years, and not even a name, not even a sign. He looked away, his face shadowed. It was better that way. Better? The word fell from her lips like a wound. "You saved my life," then disappeared as if I was nothing. "Do you have any idea what that did to me?" His silence was heavier than any answer. His hands curled slightly at his sides, as if fighting the urge to reach for her. His eyes, though steady, carried storms within them, pain, regret, and something unspoken. Finally, he spoke. "My name is Kofi." The name struck her like a bell, sharp and clear, cutting through the years of silence. Kofi. A name she had waited her whole life to hear, though she hadn't known it until now, but his explanation stopped there. No story, no reason, just a name and a wall of silence behind it. Amara searched his face, looking for cracks, for truth hidden in his eyes. She saw weariness, yes, and guilt, but also something else, something softer, something that matched the ache she had carried for a decade. "Why now?" she asked, her voice low, trembling with both hope and fear. "Why come back now?" Kofi's gaze flickered, his lips parting as though he might answer. But then he shook his head, swallowing his words. "Some questions don't have answers you're ready for." The sentence stung like fire on her skin. Before she could reply, someone called her name from across the hall, breaking the moment. The world returned, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the music. But for Amara, everything had shifted. He was here. Real. Standing before her after 10 years of being nothing more than memory and longing. And yet, he still held his secrets close, his pain hidden like a locked chest she wasn't allowed to open. She wanted to demand more, to force him to stay and speak. But as quickly as he had appeared, Kofi slipped back into the crowd, his presence heavy, his absence heavier still. Amara stood frozen, her pulse racing, her heart torn between relief and fury. He had returned, but not with answers, not with the peace she had craved. Instead, he had returned with silence and shadows, leaving her with even more questions. And deep inside, beneath the anger, beneath the confusion, a single truth grew louder. His absence had never been abandonment. It had been sacrifice. She could feel it in her bones, though he hadn't said the words, and that knowledge left her more unsettled than ever. For the first time in 10 years, Amara's ghost had stepped out of memory and into her world. But with him came secrets that could shatter everything she thought she knew. For days after the gala, Amara carried the weight of Kofi's return like a storm cloud above her. She went about her duties, helping at the community center, guiding young girls through their studies, visiting her mother. But her thoughts refused to let go of him. Kofi. The name lingered on her lips, foreign yet familiar, like a song half remembered. She repeated it silently when she was alone, testing the sound, tasting its sharpness and its softness. But with the name came more questions. Why had he vanished? Why return now, only to drown her in silence again? One evening, unable to stand the gnawing questions, Amara found herself walking the narrow road that led to the outskirts of town. She had heard whispers that Kofi was staying in a small rented room above an old tailor's shop. Her feet carried her there before her mind had time to talk her out of it. The door creaked as she entered the dimly lit space. He was there, sitting by the window, his broad frame hunched slightly, as if the world pressed too heavily on his shoulders. His hands were clasped together, scarred and strong, resting against his knees. He turned when he sensed her, surprise flashing briefly across his face before it settled into calm. "You found me," he said quietly. "I had to," she replied, her voice trembling with the courage it took to face him. "You owe me answers, Kofi." For a long moment, he didn't speak. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint hum of the town below. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he began. "I grew up with very little," he said slowly, his eyes fixed on the shadows of the street. "My father was gone before I could know him, and my mother worked herself to the bone to keep us alive. Trouble found me early. Fights, bad company, people who wanted to use me. By the time I was a man, I already carried scars you cannot see. Amara watched him, her heart twisting. His voice was steady, but there was a hardness beneath it, like stone that had weathered too many storms. The day of the fire, Kofi continued, I wasn't supposed to be there. I had been hiding, from men who wanted me silenced, from accusations I couldn't fight. They said I stole. They said I hurt someone. Lies that spread faster than truth ever could. If I stayed, they would drag me down, and anyone near me would suffer too. He paused, his jaw tightening. When I pulled you from that fire, I knew I couldn't stay. If I had, they would have found you, used you against me, hurt you. So I vanished. Not because I wanted to, Amara, but because it was the only way to keep you safe. The words hit her like a storm. For years she had believed his silence was abandonment. Now she saw it for what it truly was. Sacrifice. Her eyes burned. You think leaving me in silence was protection? Do you know what it did to me? Wondering why you disappeared? Kofi turned to her then, his gaze sharp, filled with pain. I do. Every day I thought of you. Wondered if you hated me. Wondered if you remembered me at all. But I would rather carry that pain myself than see harm touch you. Amara's chest tightened, torn between anger and gratitude. She wanted to scream at him for staying away, for letting her suffer. Yet at the same time, her heart softened at the raw honesty in his voice. She looked at him closely. Really looked. The lines on his face, the tired weight in his shoulders, the scars along his arms. He had carried battles she could not imagine. Still, her heart whispered a warning. Secrets had weight, and weight crushed even the strongest shoulders. Could she trust him? Could she open herself to someone who had already disappeared once? Her voice was barely above a whisper. So what happens now, Kofi? You've returned. But can I trust you to stay? Or will you vanish again when shadows rise? He dropped his gaze, silent. The answer she feared most was written in his hesitation. Amara turned toward the door, her chest heavy with unspoken words. I don't know if I can forgive the silence, she said softly, but I know I can't ignore the bond between us. As she stepped into the night air, her heart pounded with conflict. She was caught between anger and longing, between fear and hope. And as she walked away, Kofi remained by the window, watching her leave with eyes full of regret. His wounds, both hidden and open, had bled into her life once more, and neither of them knew whether they would heal together or break apart. The air in town had shifted. Amara felt it in the way people's voices lowered when she walked by, in the unease that clung to the marketplace, in the whispers that followed her name. At first, she ignored it. Rumors were not new. She had lived with them since the fire. But when she returned from the community center one evening to find her mother's door marked with strange chalk symbols, fear tightened around her chest like a rope. It wasn't long before she learned the truth. Kofi's past had followed him back. Word spread quickly that the men he had once fled, the ones who had branded him a thief and a traitor, were in the city again. Some said they wanted revenge. Others whispered of debts unpaid, of secrets buried in the ashes of that market fire 10 years ago. Amara confronted Kofi beneath the broken archway of the old tailor's shop. The night was heavy with silence, the streets deserted. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the fire of truth she demanded. You told me you vanished to protect me, she said. But if danger is here now, then your silence has only delayed the storm, not spared me from it. What really happened that day, Kofi? Why were they after you? Kofi's face was shadowed, his jaw tense. Because I knew too much, he said finally. The fire at the market. It wasn't an accident, Amara. It was lit. I saw them set it. They wanted to silence witnesses, erase debts, destroy those who resisted them. And his voice faltered, eyes haunted. I tried to stop them. But by the time I acted, the flames were already consuming everything. Amara's breath caught in her throat. The fire that had defined her life, the fire that had taken neighbors, homes, and hope, was not fate or chance. It was violence. A choice made by cruel men. You knew? Her words cracked, torn between grief and rage. You've carried this for 10 years and you never told me? I thought it would break you, Kofi said, his voice raw. You lost so much. I wanted you to heal, not drown in the same shadows I carried. Her heart pounded, torn in two. Part of her wanted to strike him, to scream at him for keeping the truth buried. But another part, the deeper, quieter part, saw the weight in his eyes, the years of silence etched into his soul. Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps broke the night. Shadows shifted at the edge of the alley. Men emerged, faces hard, voices low with menace. There he is, one hissed. The runaway. And the girl who won't stop asking questions. Amara's stomach dropped. She had stepped into the storm without realizing it. Kofi's body moved before thought, placing himself between her and the men. His voice was steady, but it carried a steel edge. This ends tonight. The men laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. You think you can protect her? You couldn't even protect the market. People burned because of you. The words cut like knives. Amara saw Kofi flinch, the guilt slamming into him, but he did not waver. She felt her own anger rise, no longer afraid. It was you, she spat at the strangers. You lit that fire. You stole lives, tore families apart. And now you stand here as if you hold power? The leader sneered. Power is all we've ever had. And if you're wise, you'll walk away, girl, before you're swallowed too. But Amara did not move. For years, she had lived with unanswered questions, with the ache of a ghost. Now the truth was here, and she would not retreat. Kofi's fists tightened at his sides, but his eyes softened as they met hers for a heartbeat. A silent vow passed between them. No more running, no more hiding. The storm had arrived. The men advanced, their shadows stretching across the walls. The night air crackled with the weight of everything unsaid. Love, regret, truth, vengeance. Amara felt fear coil in her chest, but beneath it was something stronger. Resolve. She had been a victim of that fire once, a girl saved by a stranger's hands. But tonight, she was not that girl anymore. Tonight, she was ready to stand beside him, even in the face of darkness. As the first blow was struck, the silence of the city shattered, and the storm of truth, long delayed, came crashing down around them both. The night after the confrontation with Kofi's enemies felt endless. Amara sat by her window, staring out into the darkness, her thoughts tangled and raw. The storm had passed, but not without leaving marks. Bruises on Kofi's face, blood on his knuckles, and fear etched deep into Amara's heart. Yet, what haunted her most was not the danger. It was the silence that lingered between them afterward. He had saved her again, as he once did in the fire. But this time, she refused to let him vanish into the night. By dawn, she found him sitting on the steps of the abandoned church at the edge of town. His shoulders slumped forward, his hands clasped tight, as though he were holding himself together. For a long moment, she simply watched him, her chest rising with both anger and tenderness. You can't keep doing this, Amara said softly, stepping closer, carrying everything alone, deciding for me what truths I can or can't bear. Kofi lifted his head. His eyes, usually so steady, looked fractured, like glass that had been stepped on too many times. I thought silence would protect you, he whispered. But it only chained me tighter. Every day I told myself you deserved better. Someone clean. Someone unbroken. Her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of years finally breaking free. Better? You're the reason I'm alive, Kofi. And yet, for 10 years, I've lived like half a soul because you chose to disappear. Do you know what it feels like? To be saved, but abandoned at the same time? The words hit him like fire. His hands shook as he reached for hers but stopped short, hovering in the space between them. "I watched you from a distance," he confessed, voice thick. "Every milestone, every step forward, I saw you. But I didn't dare come near. I thought my shadow would ruin your light." Tears welled in her eyes, unbidden. Anger still burned, but beneath it was an ache she could no longer hide. "You don't get to choose my light, Kofi. You don't get to decide what I can or cannot carry. That choice is mine." For a moment, neither spoke. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, the dawn air cool, the silence filled with all the years they had lost. Then Kofi bowed his head, his voice breaking. "Amara, I am not the man you remember. I have blood on my hands, scars you can't see. For years, I have been running from my past and from myself. I am afraid that if I give you all of me, you'll turn away." Her heart ached at his words, but she did not look away. Instead, she stepped closer, her hand finally resting on his trembling one. "And I am afraid of never knowing you at all. I would rather face your scars than live another 10 years haunted by a ghost." Kofi's eyes filled, his walls crumbling. The man who had carried the weight of silence, who had walked in shadows for a decade, finally let himself break. His tears fell, not from weakness, but from the release of a burden too heavy to bear alone. Amara pulled him into her arms, holding him the way she had longed to since the fire. And in that embrace, the years of pain, questions, and silence melted into something new, something fragile, but real. "I forgive you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Not because it erases the hurt, but because I cannot love you while holding on to anger. And I do love you, Kofi. I think I always have." For the first time in 10 years, his chest rose with something more than fear. Hope flickered in his eyes, small but steady. "And I love you," he said, the words breaking but true. "More than the years I lost, more than the scars I carry." The morning sun broke over the horizon then, casting its first golden light across the church steps. They sat together, not as strangers bound by a fire, but as two souls scarred and healed by it. The ashes of their past did not vanish. But from them, something stronger was rising, and for the first time, Amara felt that the fire had not only stolen, it had also given. It had forged a bond, one tested by time and silence, now remade in honesty and love. The days that followed moved like the breaking of a long winter. The truth, once buried under ash and fear, began to seep into the open. The men who had haunted Kofi's past were no longer whispers in the dark. With courage and evidence long hidden, Kofi stepped forward, ready to face what he had spent a decade running from. In a public hearing, voices that had once condemned him now trembled with shame as the truth emerged. Witnesses finally spoke of the corruption, the deliberate fire that had gutted the market, and the men who had orchestrated it. Kofi had not been a criminal. He had been a witness, silenced by threats and exile. Amara stood beside him through it all, her presence steady, her eyes unyielding. For 10 years, she had lived with questions and shadows. Now, she was part of the light that uncovered the truth. When the ruling cleared Kofi's name, a hush fell over the room. Relief swept through him like rain after drought. His shoulders, once heavy with invisible chains, seemed to lift for the first time in years. But redemption was more than a verdict. It was in the quiet moments that followed, in the way children no longer feared his face, in the way elders greeted him with respect instead of suspicion, in the way the marketplace began to rebuild, not just its stalls, but its spirit. Amara watched it all with a heart that finally felt whole. For so long, she had lived in half-light, grateful to be alive, yet haunted by the nameless savior who had vanished into smoke. Now she no longer clung to a ghost. The man who had carried her through flames now walked beside her, not as a stranger, but as a partner. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the rooftops gold, Amara and Kofi returned to the marketplace. The air was alive again with color and sound. Vendors calling out, children chasing each other through narrow paths, the scent of roasted spices filling the air. They stopped at the place where it had all begun, where a stall had once collapsed, pinning Amara, where fire and fate had first bound their lives together. Now rebuilt, the spot bore no scars of ash, only the laughter of a young boy running past. Amara's voice was soft but steady. 10 years ago, I thought the fire had stolen everything, but maybe it was preparing me for this moment. For you, Kofi turned to her, his expression solemn yet tender. I thought I was cursed to always bring ruin. But you, his hand found hers, warm and strong. You showed me that even in ashes life can bloom again. She smiled, a smile that carried both sorrow and joy, both past and promise. Then let's not waste what we've been given. No more silence. No more running. In that crowded, lively market, surrounded by the hum of ordinary life, they sealed their vow, not with grandeur or spectacle, but with the simple, unshakable truth of two souls who had walked through fire and found each other again. Their love was not naive. It carried scars, grief, and the memory of loss, but it was stronger for it, tempered, like steel in flame. As the evening lights flickered on, Amara felt the weight of years finally lift. She was no longer the girl saved by a stranger. She was a woman standing with the man she loved, ready to build a future forged not in fear, but in truth and redemption. And as the night settled over the market, one truth echoed louder than the rest. Sometimes fate separates souls, not to punish them, but to prepare them, prepared them for a reunion that meant far more than their first meeting ever could.